Scott, there are drones crashing in Florida. We're going to talk about that
Holy
today.
cow, Batman, there are drones crashing in Florida.
Oh, right. Oh, gosh. This is Green Tag Theme Park in 30. I'm Philip, and I'm joined by my co-host, Scott Swenson of Scott Swenson Crane Development. I'm in Los Angeles. Scott's in Tampa. We're recording live from our studios. And this week, the drones, this is, I want to say, a little bit of an old story, but we were going to wait a little bit because as these stories always happen, there's always a chain of events and there's things that unfold as we learn more information. So I was trying to wait a little bit until we got more information. And we do have, I think, more this week. So it's a good time to talk about it. So
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, all too often, and just because we are so bleeding edge when it comes to the news, all too often we will end up ending stories with, well, we'll see how this pans out, or we'll see how they execute it, or whatever. So now we have a little bit more information, and we can sound like we know a little bit more about what we're talking about.
We never know what we're talking about.
We never know.
I don't know what we do. We just sit here and talk at screens.
But people listen, so that's good. That's good. We appreciate you. All right, so let's talk about crashing drones, shall we? This is not a funny story, but we're both just punchy as heck. So
geez, yes. Okay, let's get serious.
Okay.
On December 21st, multiple drones from the Sky Elements show that was happening during the holiday show at Lake Eola in Orlando, Florida. They fell during the holiday show and they injured a 7-year-old boy named Zander who required open heart surgery. Following the incident on December 23rd, the FAA opened an investigation into the incident and suspended Sky Elements Part 107 waiver, halting all-night drone flights and flights over populated areas. Investigations by the FAA and NTSB are still underway. They haven't released any full detailed reports about this or what their findings have been. It's been a few weeks, but they just are still underway. So Sky Elements, since it lost its waiver, has since canceled its drone shows at multiple venues like the Reunion Tower in Dallas and other areas in Florida. I'd say a lot of shows in Dallas and Florida and kind of like the South region, but it had a lot of shows planned for New Year's, of course, and for Christmas. And so they kind of swept through a lot of major attractions. Now, Universal Orlando Resort removed their drones from the nighttime sensational show, the Lagoon show they have there, immediately. So like the next day, Universal Orlando grounded all of those drones. And to my knowledge, they remain grounded now while this investigation is ongoing. They didn't say that there was a specific link between the two, as in they didn't mention that like Sky Elements was involved or not. And I don't think they are, because I believe that Orlando operates them themselves with their own team. But they did halt them regardless.
Parks are going to do that because, again, they can't handle any sort of
the crowd issue,
or liability if, God forbid, something did happen. It'll be like it would be the nail in the coffin for drones, and Universal's smart enough. The Universal team is smart enough to recognize that, so they're not gonna run that risk.
Yeah. So since then, Sky Elements has expressed regret and pledged to reevaluate its process, but that's basically it. And then Zander is fine now. Well, fine relatively. He did have to have a valve replaced, but the local community actually is the one that raised the money to support the heart surgery through a GoFundMe, which is a whole separate conversation about why that Sky Elements or somebody else didn't help with that heart surgery, and also why the insurance company didn't cover it. But that's a separate podcast. But back to the attractions. So this has definitely sent shockwaves through the industry, not just on all the shows that they had to cancel, but also, as you just mentioned, about how the other parks that are utilizing drones now are like wary about that whole thing. And of course, Sky Elements is a reevaluating, blah, blah, blah. But I think what this comes down to, there's a few things that we can talk about here, but besides the impact, it's like, can the FAA really regulate these? Because the FAA is notoriously understaffed, and then the drones have the technology around them has really advanced, right, over the time. So can they? How much? How realistic is that? And the big thing that we all know that that all of us in the industry, even the person that sent this over to us, talked about is that the big thing with the drones is, like fireworks, that they really just have safety zones. They have to have X amount of space between the drones and the people. So that's a big question that I have, which we're probably not going to know the answer for a while, I guess, is were those safety zones intact and they were just wrong? Or was the family standing outside the safety zones? Or were the drones outside the safety zones? Or was it some weird amalgamation, which is more what I think it is. I think it might be like a mix of like the drones drifted plus, because potentially with the safety zones, right? Like you're relying on the crowds to that, like the operations team to make sure the crowds are in the right place.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's always a big problem with events that are not theme parks, in that theme parks have physical barriers. But when you're setting these things up in places they don't have, it's just a lake. You can walk 20 feet past the tape or whatever. So anyway, that's my thing, Scott. Tell me.
Well, yeah, no, that's absolutely true. And I mean, even I think it's interesting that you made the connection right away, because that was what I was going to do first, was the connection between fireworks and drones. Everyone was thinking that drones were going to be the replacement for fireworks, which I've said from the get-go they are not. And what we've seen now is, as the technology and the implementation continues, we're seeing drones as an addition to fireworks. You mentioned Universal. That show, they are used pretty much like a slideshow in the middle of a giant fireworks and light and water show. So that's one element that I think is important to recognize is, and to make things even more interesting, the technology that I've seen most recently are the drones that now fire fireworks from them. So
yeah.
It's really no different than when fireworks started to become very popular in parks. There was a lot of there's a lot of safety elements that have to go into it. I know that Disney, for example, they've got this down to a science with fireworks, to the point where if the wind is blowing so much a certain direction, they know exactly where to clear. They know they can, and I know this from having project managed enough fireworks shows at Busch. The moment the wind shifts, there has to be real-time changes made to how you fire fireworks, which shells you can and cannot fire. We used to design shows, for example, fireworks shows that had low, medium, and high shells, so that if the wind got above a certain level, we would immediately, there was a stop button where we just cut the high shells and the rest of the show fired as planned. I don't know enough about drones to be able to say that that's exactly what can happen here. I have been involved with a couple of different drone shows. One of them was at SeaWorld in Abu Dhabi. And I know that one of the biggest concerns they had was not only what they were flying over, but the proximity that they flew to each other. Now, I don't know what happened at Lake Eola. I don't know exactly whether they collided, whether it as you say, did it blow off? Did it blow off course? Was there a programming or a guidance failure of some sort? I don't know. But one of the other issues that we have to at least throw in, and I know this only because, again, I was involved with the show, is that there was a specific ruling as to the proximity they could be to one another, so that if one did get too close, it did one of two things. There was a risk of collision, of course, and the second was that one might pick up the other's radio signal, basically, its control. So two would become one, and that's not good. So, but I think that this is another stumbling block, and I do not mean to be cold-hearted towards Zander or his family at all, or anyone who may have any mishaps from a drone show. But it's also, we have to look at this as, this is new technology. It's going to have new rules. We're going to have to continue to develop, just like we did with fireworks. We're going to have to continue to develop rules and laws and expectations, because, we've all heard that drones, the end game for drones is clearly not theme park shows. The end game for drones that I've seen is Uber, basically, so that or delivery for packages and that sort of thing. So for that kind of drone, obviously, I think the FAA does have to be involved, because that's not flying even over private property. That's flying over multiple layers of private property. It's flying over state and government-owned property. It's flying everywhere. So when it comes to, can the FAA or should the FAA be involved, there's no question in my mind they should be involved in that regard. Anything that carries a payload, any drone that carries a human being or, for example, carries fireworks, should probably fall under FAA. Now, can they do it? I don't know the answer to that. You bring up a very good point, Philip. They're understaffed, and we all know it. So that's a challenge there. But as far as impact on the industry, I think that it is. I won't say it is a nail in the coffin, but I think it is definitely a red flag, and I think it would be irresponsible for parks not to go back and reevaluate their safety protocols. And reevaluate the safety protocols of the outside companies that are doing these, because only the Jimongo parks have the ability to do to do their own drones.
Yeah.
Most parks or most organizations will use an outside contractor because they just don't have the manpower or the expertise to do this in-house, unless you happen to be one of the big boys, one of the big parks.
Yeah.
This also raises a very interesting question for me, and that is the flying dragon that we've seen tested for Epic. Is that going to fall under FAA because it's not over a controlled environment? It's my understanding is it flies over guests. Now I don't know that yet because obviously the park hasn't opened, but looking at the way they're testing it, it looks like it's flying over inhabited land. So. I just think like I said, I don't want to overreact to this. I think it is a terrible thing that happened. It should not have happened. And I think even Sky Elements would say, well, absolutely, this should not have happened.
Yeah.
They're going to be on the side of safety as well, because they recognize if drone shows are considered unsafe or illegal or require so much sanction or so much permitting or so much insurance, and we'll talk about that in a second, then their company goes under. So they're going to be interested in safety as well. It's just like everybody gets mad at theme parks when there's severe weather and they close down rides. Yeah. Well, that's out of safety. That's not just to piss off guests. That is a safety issue.
It's not just to save money and piss off people. Yeah,
exactly. So I think we'll have to see what's going to happen here, but. This incident, I will tell you right now, this incident has just made every single drone show significantly more expensive to run. And not because of the staffing, not because of the the regulatory oversight, but simply because of the insurance. Liability insurance has now, I am sure, skyrocketed for drone shows. And my guess is, and this is just a guess, but my guess is that it's going to be regional. My guess is that Florida will, because it happened here, Florida will be extra cautious because it was on the front page of all the newspapers. It was the top of Spectrum Bay News 9, both in Orlando and in Tampa and in Miami, and so again, I don't think this is a nail in the coffin, but it does open up some very interesting follow-up that is going to need to be done. And as you said, Philip, we kind of held this off for a little bit so that we could get to see what that follow-up was going to be. And you asked why didn't the insurance or the Sky Elements or whatever immediately just come in and take care of the injury. That makes me think that they were able to prove that there was some, and I'll put this in giant air quotes, fault on behalf of Zander and his family. Somehow he wasn't. Somehow they weren't in the safe zone, or somehow. And I don't know that. I'm guessing. I'm spitballing here. But I know how insurance works, and if they can prove that someone in that chain was negligent, they will kick it to them.
Yep.
Which is part of the reason, by the way, that roller coasters shut down in lightning, because the theme parks, when they build roller coasters, all the major parks, all of the liability goes back to the manufacturer. So they are required to follow the manufacturer's rules and regulations for all of their attractions and all of their rides. They don't, Six Flags doesn't make up the rules for their coasters. the manufacturer makes up the rules for the coasters. Six Flags chooses to, if they break those rules, then Six Flags becomes liable if anything goes wrong. If they follow those rules, then it goes back to the manufacturer.
Yep.
And Six Flags, that's true of all the parks. I'm not picking on Six Flags.
No, it's true outside. I mean, we just had something recently also with Gantum where we just had to explain that to somebody. We're like, it's like the end person, the person that's using it, in this case, the theme park or the theme place, I think, is using it improperly, which is avoiding of the warranty, because you're using it. It doesn't matter who bought it, but the person who's using it is using it improperly.
Correct.
And that's what we look to oftentimes. That's why I wonder, and like you're saying, I wonder in a lot of these situations, you always wonder, because so much of what we do at theme parks, I don't know. I know this is a gross oversimplification, but it comes down to people who may or may not be well trained. I just always think of like Six Flags and like the kids reheating burger patties or the people loading stuff. And you're like, it comes down to these people who may or may not, be really understand. Like you tell them, this is how you're supposed to operate this thing, and you don't really explain, well, it's because if you, then there's safety and there's voiding, but
ironically, the first thing that is cut usually in theme park budgets is training. So,
yeah. So that's why. So it's interesting, you bring up a lot of elements, and I am very interested about the insurance element, and but I think so. We will know eventually where who was at fault. Eventually it's going to come out because it's too big of a story for them to kind of lock it away. So eventually we're going to know, was it the local, like the ops team, like I'm saying the ops team, when they guide people into areas to stand, were they not doing that properly, or any of these, or, that, or was it the family who got out of that area somehow, or was it the drone, or wherever? We're going to know at some point. But I think regardless, no matter what happens with the outcome of this, I agree with you that the cost of the shows is going to go up in the short term.
Mm-hmm.
And because it's not going to matter, really. I think to your point, it's not going to matter, or I believe this is your point. It's not going to matter who was at fault, because it was such a big story. The cost is going to go up no matter what.
It is proven now. It is proven that people can get injured at drone shows.
Yes. Yeah. And so there's no way it's the cost.
Let's be completely honest. Let's be completely honest. People can get injured driving a car.
Yeah.
So one of the things when you get your first car, you save up enough money to buy your first car, and then all of a sudden you realize, oh crap, I have to spend how much on insurance?
Yeah. So that's an interesting thing. Yeah. I think for our listeners, one of the big takeaways is no matter what happens, it's going to be more expensive to do drone shows. And in the short term, at least, there's going to be a lot of this whole thing about waiting to see what regulations are updated, and this whole uncertainty. But I do believe that in the long term, that will settle down, and much like fireworks, we'll get into a rhythm where it'll probably always be more expensive. Like the price that it's going to up to right now in this crazy regulatory jump, that's probably going to be relatively where it's going to stay until we get to the point where drones become as cheap as batteries. In which case, I think you'll get a little bit of price reduction, but the regulation is what's going to be expensive. The insurance is what's going to be expensive. And I think that's going to be in the future.
Fireworks have been the same way. The technology in fireworks people don't think about it, but has improved thousands and thousands of percent since it was some guy with a match lighting off a rocket that shot up and going boom. The technology there is, they know exactly where those things are going to go. They know that they have programs an AI that will show them, here's where it's going to go if the wind's blowing at this speed, here's where it's going to go if the wind goes at this speed. And we don't hear very often about injuries, knock wood, because of fireworks. But I remember as a kid, and this is going, since I'm old, this is going way, way back. I remember as a kid being on a beach and having fallout because the wind changed from a land breeze to an ocean breeze, and they were shooting them out over the water. And all of a sudden, there are fireballs as big as my head. Now, I was smaller then, so it was probably that big. But fireballs as big as my head coming down on the beach, and people were just grabbing their blankets and running to the car.
Yeah.
So it's not something that's going to be insurmountable. I don't want to make more of it than is necessary, but it is going to have to go through that same sort of difficult growth process.
Yeah.
Most drones, once they, like, for example, if it's a battery issue, when the batteries get down to a certain level, most drones have an internal program, not something that's sent from elsewhere, but have an internal program that their first response is to get back to home. So when they get to, if their battery starts to drain too quickly, and it gets to a certain point, the first programming is to go back to their home base. The second bit of programming is to, the ones that I worked with are to flash red and drop straight down, slowly descend straight down, flashing red. So I don't know whether that was, the way these drones worked. I don't know, but it's just one of those things that, maybe it even comes down to educating the audience to say, if you see a drone coming straight down and it's flashing red, get out of the way.
Yeah.
Or you have your staff that will immediately see the moment they see a flashing red drone. This is the way they did it at SeaWorld Abu Dhabi. If they saw a flashing red drone, there were 3 people on the floor who would go and clear the space.
Yeah. We're going to learn all that later, but I will say, having a drone myself and having crashed it many times, and at least 3 times in which it had to be completely refurbished because it exploded. But I will say that
Philip, you weren't at Lake Eola by any chance, were you?
No. But I will say, like, all those programming contingencies are fine, but honestly, like, if it crashes, you just can't do anything. It's just gravity. So, like, if these two really did crash into each other, the propellers break, and then, like, it's not like it can slowly fall and flash red. Like, it just breaks and then it just falls, right? So, and it's dark and you can't see it, so I don't know. There's videos about this, people can go and
once again,
them.
That's why we had the proximity rule. Yeah. That's why we had the proximity rule.
But I'm just going to add, just like with fire, again, fireworks is such a good thing, because just like with fireworks, like, the thing is, there could be things that have changed since you cleared the site, right? Like, so there could be potentially birds or some sort of other obstruction in the way, or now there could be somebody else's drone. Like, there could be because I know some, unless I don't even want to get into this because it's going to be a whole thing, but I know some YouTubers, that send drones out into fireworks to get videos of them. And so these are all things where you're like, okay, well,
and because of that goes back to, yes, then the FAA should be involved.
But they can't regulate those private drones. So, technically they can, like, or they're supposed to, but there's also, like, not really a way to stop them, because they'll just override it.
Most theme parks are no-fly zones. Most theme parks are no-fly zones.
No, not. Okay.
Bush.
Let's take 3 steps back. Some theme parks are no-fly zones. However, where you're flying the drones is not necessarily in the no-fly zone. And then that brings it back to smaller attractions. Like the Lake Eola is not, I assume it's not a no-fly zone. Or, places like Lake Eola are. So I think there's slivers, because I know some vloggers, so I can't name names. I know some that have flown. There's people that fly over Epic all the time. That's clearly
you can see that on, that doesn't mean that it's not a no-fly zone. What it means is somebody's doing it and getting away with it. So to your point, can the FAA actually regulate it if they want to?
Correct.
And you can fly over parks that are considered no-fly zones, but you have to be above a certain altitude.
Yep.
And that was the way it was at Busch when I worked there. That's the way it was at SeaWorld. Disney was that way. Universal is that way. So I'm guessing Epic is a no-fly zone, and the stuff that they're getting is either flown just outside the perimeter of the ground surface of the park, or they're breaking the law.
Yeah. Well, probably. People break. They do that kind of stuff all the time with.
I know.
But I'm just saying. There are things you can't. There are a lot of things you can't really control, actually. Like, as much as you think you can, or whatever. When you're flying drones, even I remember going to an area where there was a tiny power cable that I didn't see, right, and then it hit the drone, and then it got tangled and dropped right immediately. There are, like, so I'm just saying, it's possible for there to be obstructions you didn't predict, even if it's completely free of all things when you first inspect it, but then suddenly there's a bird, or there's some other thing in the air that's not supposed to be there, or there's all sorts of things.
And with any sort of commercial filming, you have to get, in most cities and most towns, you have to get
Yeah.
a
Good luck enforcing that. Yeah.
I,
I know
I
you're
understand.
supposed to.
I understand that. Well, but good luck enforcing any law. I mean,
Yeah. But
I
it may
can
not
promise
even
you,
be
every one of our listeners right now has sped in their car and not gotten a ticket
correct.
for it.
Yeah.
So,
Well, and this is my point with the FAA. I'm like, yeah, they can put the stuff out there, but it's not really gonna change anything. Like, I mean, it may not
except,
even be a filming drone. It could be it could be any type of drone. Like it could be just a FPV one, that then like I think this is one of my biggest things. I bring this up all the time to places where they go um there are some places that are like, well, you can't, blah, 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 you can't fly a drone or XYZ. And I'm like, right. Like, I mean, I'm going to listen to you because I don't want to cause issues, but what would you do to stop me? And the
well,
answer
and
is
if something,
nothing.
I guess the issue is if something does happen and they didn't pull a permit for the drone, then there's another bit of hand slapping that can go on. If you had to pull permits for a drone and it causes an accident, and you find out who was flying the drone that didn't have the permit,
Yeah.
just like you have to have a permit for fireworks. I think fireworks is probably the best parallel here. That's, I think,
Yeah.
the
And that's what I
real
mean. You
positive.
can't, I think the biggest thing though, is that in this case, or places that are not not large theme parks, like in this case, there's so much more. I just think of like all my friends that have drones and how many of them have FPVs and they all like to do crazy shit with it. And you're like, well, guests could have come to the lake and brought drones and flown them into the show on their own easily. Or they
Yeah.
could have flown them from the house nearby. Or there's so many. And I'm not trying to make this seem like it's a big conspiracy. Like I'm not trying to be like, oh, but I'm just saying like there's so much you can't control in this, and I think that's going to make it hard, right, for any rule. And so that's going to be another layer of us thinking about it, because like
Sure.
in general,
Sure.
guests really can't bring fireworks that can launch to that altitude just like in their pockets and show up at things, and like interfere. But it,
Yeah, they can.
yeah, well,
Yeah,
okay,
they can.
so
I mean,
it's just a whole nother
a
level.
giant mortar shell is that big. I mean, they're tiny.
Yeah,
They're not large. So,
well, anyway, I think that's all part of it. But I think overall, the trend for this is that you mentioned way earlier about the drone progress, and it's not 2025 is going to be the year of the drones. It's not going to get any less at all, because Amazon's already expanding its drone delivery program to several cities from Phoenix. It's been going in Phoenix, and they're expanding it to several other cities. And I think individual states dictate a lot about how the drones are regulated, but it's definitely going to be expanding in our use capability, because it's not just delivery. It's also, there's so many military applications. I already use them now for a ton of military, but it's a lot of surveillance and it's a lot of delivery. And I think in just those two veins, you're going to see a lot of expansion in this. And also, to one of your points you made earlier, like in terms of stack ranking these, like the Sky Elements shows are relatively low risk, because to what your point earlier, like they start in a place and they move and they do a thing and they go back to that place, which is much less than like a drone delivery, like Amazon, like delivering packages to neighborhoods, right? And then also for surveillance drones that are just going in place like all over unpredictable areas. Like, these are going in a predictable pattern, doing a predictable thing in a predictable place. And so I think because of all these elements, I do think that this is not going to be the end of drone shows by any stretch. It's just unfortunate that it happened to Sky Elements because they are such a big brand. However, maybe that's a good thing that they are a big enough brand that they can kind of, like Disney, like kind of take a little bit of the heat in order to drive progress for the industry. But ultimately, when you invent the car, you also invent the car crash.
right.
And it's unfortunate, no one likes to see this happen. But
you use the example of the observation drones that are flying all over, really.
Yeah.
But when weather balloons first started, they fell on livestock and killed cows. So there's going to be
that. Yeah, I forgot about that. But yeah, you're right. Yeah, at every point.
There's always going to be some sort of stumbling block, because as you say, when you invent the car, you invent the car crash. When you invent the drone, you invent the drone crash. But I think the most important thing to recognize is, in the short term, especially in the southeastern part of the United States, that drone shows are going to be under magnifying glass. And just like after any coaster crash, that kind of coaster is always put on hold or suspended, and there's some sort of investigation done. Unfortunately, from this kind of negativity, that's really the only way you can force some sort of progress.
Yeah. It was going to happen. It was
Exactly.
going to happen, and it's unfortunate.
Seatbelts were invented because of car crashes.
Yeah, we're not. I mean, I'm definitely not happy about this, and I really, you never wish for a child to be hurt, but it was going to happen by just this is how it works. It was going to, it was almost like impossible to say there was going to be a drone show when never a drone crash. Like that's impossible. It was going to happen somewhere, sometime.
Well, we've actually been droning on this entire show, so it's
true.
time
for us. I didn't know we were going to spend the whole time talking about drones.
I know, I didn't either, but hey, it's a good topic because it is such a hot topic and such a very important topic. So, but we are done for this episode. So once again, thank you all so much for listening. On behalf of Philip Hernandez and myself, Scott Swenson, this is Green Tag Theme Park in 30, and we will see you next week.
Or we'll see you in our Patreon episode. Go to patreon.com and search for Green Tag. We have our Patreon where we're going to be continuing with our predictions and trends for 2025.